Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short, and we are talking about Christianity, the worldview, and its relationship to government, society, and politics in this election year. And one of the big issues that always comes up every 4 years at the presidential election level is the issue of abortion. As Christians, reading our Bibles, coming from our moral value systems, we believe that abortion is the killing of innocent babies in the womb. That's the basic Christian understanding of abortion. And so obviously we want to be careful that we never ever empower anyone in office or empower any party or encourage in any shape or fashion the killing of unborn children in the womb of abortion. And so what I have been hearing lately, a very disturbing trend, is that among evangelical Christians, there is a movement to try to, in some way, make acceptable voting for someone who is anti-life or pro-choice. And this has become something that I have been hearing more and more, specifically this year, more than ever. I've been hearing different people talk in terms of they are going to vote for a pro-abortion candidate, Joe Biden, because they like his policies and they like his economic plan and so on and so forth. And so they're going to vote for Joe Biden, the pro-abortion candidate. And what's so strange about this is that this kind of talk you didn't hear before in many Christian quarters, but you are hearing more of it. And there is an argument actually that's being made why Christians should be able to vote for a pro-abortion candidate and vote for a pro-abortion party. And I want to go over that argument, and I actually want to refute that argument today. So we're going to look at Phil Fisher, who is the originator and artist on the Veggie Tales, the children's animated cartoons. And he is what you might call one of these who is probably, if I can understand what he's talking about, probably going to be voting for Joe Biden, or he's going to be voting for Democrats who are pro-abortion. And he is one of these people who seemingly is okay with the fact that he's empowering candidates to kill babies in the womb. He's empowering the spread of abortion, and instead of outlawing abortion, he is actually in favor of not outlawing abortion. So let's look at one of his presentations, because he's going to roll a video that actually gives the argument why a Christian who is pro-life might still vote for a pro-abortion candidate. And I want to take it apart as much as I can here. So let's bring up the video on screen, and there we go, and let's roll this video.
I was in high school in the early 1980s when evangelical Christians first started focusing on abortion. And the one thing we all agreed on was that overturning Roe versus Wade was the key to reducing abortion in America. 40 years later, we still haven't overturned Roe. Today, some pro-life evangelical Christians are asking whether this is still the right focus of so much of our attention. Is overturning Roe the key to reducing abortion? Our friend David French made an argument that really got us thinking. And when my podcast co-host, Sky Jatani, echoed that argument on Twitter, people said, hey, you should make a video about that. So we did. Here's my buddy Sky trying to answer the question, is overturning Roe versus Wade the key to reducing abortion in America? And if it isn't, what is?
So a background, Roe v. Wade was a decision made by the Supreme Court in 1973 that basically legalized abortion in all 50 states. It's not an option now. Abortion has to be allowed in all 50 states, whereas before Roe, there were states that had banned abortion or had strictly regulated abortion. It was up to the individual states. Since Roe v. Wade, all states must, in principle, allow abortion. And so the focus has been to overturn Roe v. Wade, send it back to the states. That would allow then states that didn't want this baby-killing murder atrocity happening in their borders, they could outlaw it. They could ban it outright. And so we've been fighting to try to get to that. Well, this argument's going to be against overturning Roe v. Wade as a strategy to curtailing abortions.
It's okay if you disagree, but it's worth having the conversation, okay? Here it is.
For almost 50 years, Christians have been told that who you support for president will either save or sacrifice the lives of unborn babies. This has led a lot of pro-life Christians to become single-issue voters, willing to overlook everything else about a candidate as long as they're against abortion.
Well, that's not exactly true. When we look at abortion, it is one of the main issues that Christian voters, evangelicals, for example, in 2016 voted overwhelmingly 81% plus for Trump, and he was pro-life. He ran on a pro-life ticket. And that was one of the main issues, but not the only one issue. This presentation seems to make it out to be, well, Christians are only voting for a candidate because of the abortion issue. Wrong. Usually, if a candidate is pro-life, he's usually pro-family. He's usually pro-marriage. He doesn't agree with the LGBTQ gay marriage whole movement. And so when you get a pro-life candidate, it usually brings a lot of other Christian values down the table, not just one single issue voting. So this is a wrong observation here by the presenter here.
When a candidate's bad character or unchristian policies are brought up, the response is often, yeah, but abortion. The argument looks something like this. My vote determines the president nominates justices to the Supreme Court can overturn Roe v. Wade, and overturning Roe will make abortion illegal and save babies. Let's unpack what's wrong with this argument and why your vote for president might not impact abortion the way you think. Let's look at 3 common assumptions. Number 1, a Republican president will appoint pro-life justices to the Supreme Court to end abortion. Since the Roe decision in 1973, Republican presidents have appointed 11 justices to the Supreme Court, and very soon it could be 12. Democratic presidents have only appointed 4. For 49 of the last 50 years, Republicans have held a majority on the Supreme Court.
That is an observation that's misleading, because you might say that justices who were appointed by Republicans held the majority on the Supreme Court. It doesn't mean they're conservative. It doesn't mean that they are pro-life. It doesn't mean that they would overturn Roe v. Wade, because it's very difficult to know how a justice will actually decide a particular case brought before them. So we have to admit that, for example, Ronald Reagan, who was a very pro-life president and ran on a pro-life ticket and got most of the evangelical votes, he appointed judges who he thought were going to interpret the Constitution rather than legislate from the bench. Well, he was wrong on a number of judges. For example, Sandra Day O'Connor, he appointed the first woman justice to the Supreme Court. He felt, and a lot of other Christians hoped, that she would be someone who would oppose Roe v. Wade. It turns out she actually was upholding Roe v. Wade. She was actually more of a feminist than anyone knew. And this has happened time and time again. It happened with George H.W. Bush. It happened with George W. Bush. And it seems to be that even if a person shows the signs of being a conservative originalist in their past decisions, it really is no guarantee that they are going to do something like overturn Roe v. Wade. So the Republicans have actually appointed a number of justices who have maintained Roe v. Wade, which is really discouraging, but that should not stop us from trying. You can't stop trying just because you failed in the past.
Despite this Republican domination of the court for 5 decades, it hasn't overturned Roe. For example, in 1992, Republicans had an 8-to-1 majority on the Supreme Court. 5 of those 8 Republican justices had been appointed by Reagan or Bush, both stridently pro-life presidents. And that one Democratic justice on the court, Byron White, he voted against Roe in 1973. But when a case came before the court that year which could have overturned Roe, the Republican-appointed justices didn't do it. Instead, they reaffirmed the right to an abortion. And even as recently as 2020, a Louisiana law restricting abortion was struck down by Chief Justice John Roberts, who was appointed by George W. Bush.
That's right. And this is one of the big disappointments in the pro-life movement. This is one of the big disappointments among evangelical Christians, that even though we are trying to elect presidents who will appoint semi-sane judges, in other words, non-activistic judges, still, there seems to be a force, a power in Washington that when justices go to the bench, they are pulled left. They seem to be pulled in the activistic direction. And it could be explained by simply a power grab. You have to realize that when you're in Washington and when you are on the Supreme Court, you are in one of the most powerful positions on the planet Earth. Your decisions can determine the fates of millions of lives and policies that you hand down. And so there is a temptation. The old saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, there's no example of a greater absolute power than on the Supreme Court. And some of these judges, unfortunately, have allowed their position and their power to go to their head. And they have begun to take on the role of some kind of philosopher king, where they stand on Mount Olympus and make decisions for everyone else, and they don't have to have the regular legislative process in the Senate or the House of Representatives. They can just make decisions, whatever the rationale is. And so, unfortunately, the corrupting power of sin has brought some of these justices to a position where they have actually upheld Roe v. Wade instead of overturned Roe v. Wade. But again, we don't stop trying just because of failures in the past. William Wilberforce, when he was attempting to outlaw slavery in Britain in the 1800s, kept bringing it up and kept bringing it up year after year after year. And finally, he was rewarded with the satisfaction of seeing the slave trade ended. So we can't give up just because we keep falling short of the goal of overturning Roe v. Wade.
And here's the important part. In his ruling, Roberts cited the legal principle of stare decisis. That's the belief that the court should abide by its previous rulings. So for decades, the Republican-dominated Supreme Court has only reaffirmed rather than reversed Roe v. Wade. And if Chief Justice Roberts says the court should abide by its previous rulings, it's looking less and less likely that the court will ever overturn Roe, no matter how many conservatives are on it. That's why David French, a civil liberties lawyer and strong pro-life conservative, says this: for almost 3 decades, the Supreme Court lesson has been clear. Put not your trust in judges to rescue America from the moral stain of abortion. Right now, you might be thinking, but Sky, those justices from the 80s and 90s were too moderate. We still need more serious pro-life people on the Supreme Court, and then things will change. That brings us to the second assumption. Overturning.
Well, it is true that we've learned some lessons from the past. And I think, for example, the Federalist Society, which has helped President Donald Trump pick his justices to nominate and then appoint to the bench, the Federalist Society has been trying to do a better job in vetting justices so that when they get to the Supreme Court and when they're seated on the bench, they don't turn left or they don't turn activist. And so, having learned from the past, I think we're in a better position to actually appoint judges who give us a chance of overturning Roe v. Wade.
Roe is the key to ending abortion. Politicians talk about Roe.
No, I don't think pro-life Christians feel that ending Roe is the key to ending abortion, but it's a step on the road to eliminating abortion eventually long term. So you have to get to the point where you allow some states to actually ban the practice altogether. And then you can begin to chip away at the individual states, and that's going to be a long process. In some states, they may never, ever get to the point where they end abortion, but at least you can begin to see progress in the direction of eliminating abortion entirely. So let's not disparage the ending of Roe v. Wade. Let's try to end it and then go from there to other goals.
V. Wade a lot. Republicans get their voters excited by promising to overturn it, and Democrats get their voters fired up by vowing to defend it. You'd think the entire issue of abortion hangs on this one case, but the truth is a lot more complicated than that. Here's what people forget. The Roe decision in 1973 did not legalize abortion, and simply reversing Roe wouldn't make it illegal. For example, according to the CDC, in 1972, the year before Roe, there were nearly...
It did legalize abortion in all 50 states as a law that you cannot then ban abortion in your state. So if you have a state of the Union in 1973 that had almost an entire ban on abortion, when Roe came along, that ban was wiped out. So in a sense, it did legalize abortion in those states that didn't allow it. And so this is kind of misleading again.
600,000 legal abortions in the U.S. That doesn't account for the thousands of abortions that were unreported or performed by unlicensed doctors. And in those states where abortion was illegal before Roe, it was still way more common than you might think. In Michigan, for example, in 1971 to 72, nearly 30,000 women traveled to New York for an abortion. We might assume that...
Well, that will happen after Roe v. Wade is overturned. You will have women in states that have banned the outrageous practice of abortion. You will have them going out of state to get their abortions. Well, if they're going to go out of state to do some barbaric practice, that's okay as far as the territory of Michigan, for example, because at least you have a state then that if it were to ban abortion after Roe v. Wade is overturned, you would be able to say, in this place, on this geographical location in the United States, you cannot do abortions. Abortion-free zone, which is better than what it is right now.
Because biblical values were commonplace at America's founding, that abortion must have been illegal and super rare until recently. But actually, it's just the opposite. In 1776, abortion was legal everywhere in the United States. In fact, abortion was...
Well, there wasn't a law that specifically said you cannot perform an abortion, but the social peer pressure and the moral peer pressure was against it. And so you actually didn't need a law from Congress, or you didn't need a law stating in plain English, you cannot kill your baby in the womb, because everybody basically saw it as such a ghastly and brutal practice that they were against it, at least in the Christian worldview in the founding of our nation.
So widespread in America in the 19th century that one doctor in Missouri said, quote, "The evidence will bear out the assertion that in no age of the world has there been a more reckless disregard for the lives of unborn human beings than in this present age, and among the civilized and professedly Christianized nations of the earth."
So he said abortion was widespread in the 1800s. What do you mean by widespread? Give me some numbers. Give me statistics. I question that characterization of abortion in the United States in the 1800s. There might have been abortions taking place, but actually widespread, you have to clarify that. That's misleading.
And that was in 1874, nearly 100 years before Roe v. Wade. Significant restrictions on abortion didn't start appearing in some states until the late 19th and early 20th century.
And that's probably because they didn't need to be there. You don't need to tell people to not do something. For example, you could say the same thing with the so-called gay marriage. There weren't any laws against gay marriage. Well, you know what? You probably didn't need any laws against gay marriage until the last 15 or 20 years, because there really wasn't an issue. No one in their right mind would have even conceived of the possibility of two men or two women actually going through with what they would call a marriage. Sure, there were those partnerships or those friendships or whatever you want to call them that were homosexual, but really the United States and most of the people here in this country never would have conceived that you would have to have a law against gay marriage until the recent sexual revolution of the 60s and then the rise of the gay rights movement during the 70s and 80s.
But even after those laws were passed in the 1930s, doctors still performed an estimated 800,000 abortions every year. That's about the same number that's happening today. So the idea that before Roe, abortion was illegal...
I really question that number. He doesn't cite any sources, but I think that number is totally fabricated. 800,000 abortions in the United States in 1930? That sounds like a big, fat lie.
...and rare in America is just not true. That false narrative, however, is very useful to both political parties. Republicans act like the country before Roe was a Christian utopia, and Democrats present the...
No, Christians don't act like life in America before Roe was a Christian utopia. Nobody's saying that. It just didn't have the outright baby-killing, murderous practice of abortion prevalent.
Pre-Roe America as a hell on earth for women, but neither is entirely true. That's also why overturning Roe wouldn't be a decisive win. Instead, we would just return to the state-by-state patchwork of laws that existed before 1973. And just before 1973, women living in a state without abortion could still cross state lines to see a doctor or just order an abortion-inducing drug over the internet, which wasn't possible in 1973. According to the study...
So it wouldn't solve all the abortion problem, but it would be a step in the right direction.
The most optimistic outcome would be a nationwide reduction of 12%. That's why David French said, quote, "Even if Roe is overturned, abortion will be mostly unchanged in the U.S." And
the problem is that you would actually be able to have abortion-free zones in this country. And if you're a Christian, you understand the blood of innocence was a major tipping point for God's wrath in the Old Testament. You would say, well, at least all the geographical location in the United States wouldn't be the target of God's wrath if he were to come and judge the sin of abortion. It would be those predominantly abortion-free zones or abortion pro-abortion zones like New York, California, and some of the other wildly abortion states. Those would be the target of God's wrath. But some of the other states that have banned the practice would not be the target of God's wrath if he were to judge his country.
Quote, "I know what you're thinking, but Sky, 12% is still a lot of abortions. That's a lot of babies. If overturning Roe will save even 1%...
I question that figure again. He's throwing figures out. He's not sorting sources, and he's not digging deeper into these, and he can't probably because of this short presentation. But still, I question that it would only save 12% of the babies.
Isn't it worth it? Yes, of course it is. The issue is not whether overturning Roe would help. It would. The issue is what will help the most. Should Christians continue following the same path they've been on for the last 50 years of ignoring every other issue to elect a pro-life president to appoint?
Christians are not ignoring every other issue. Again, this is a mischaracterization. Usually a pro-life candidate is pro-family, they're pro-marriage, they have a whole host of issues that they align with the Christian worldview. It's not just one issue. So this is totally false.
Pro-life justices to overturn one case to maybe someday hopefully reduce abortions by 12%? Or is there a better way to tackle this problem right now that has nothing to do with who's president? Let's look at two states, one red and one blue. Between 2011 and 2014, Texas passed a number of laws restricting abortion. As a result, abortions declined by 28%. That's more than double the reduction if Roe was overturned. Delaware, a blue state, did even better. Between 2014 and 2017, Delaware improved access to healthcare for its poorest residents. As a result, abortions in that state declined by an encouraging 37%, 3 times more than overturning Roe alone would accomplish. While the politicians have everyone...
That's a very difficult statistic to understand because, for example, now a lot of the abortions that are chemical abortions, which is the woman takes a pill in the privacy of her home and then aborts her baby into the toilet, still a gruesome practice, that is not usually counted. So it's very difficult to get exact statistics. So when they talk about some states reducing abortion, well, they're talking about the ones that are counted, the ones that usually occur in an office, abortion clinic, surgical abortion. They're not talking about these chemically induced abortions that women can buy over and get in the mail. So these statistics are very sketchy.
On both sides, focused on defending or reversing Roe, we're missing the local and state policies that are actually impacting abortion right now. Roe is a piece of the very complicated pro-life puzzle, but it's just a piece, and not even a very big one. Putting aside Roe and the Supreme Court for a minute, let's talk about the last assumption. Number 3, the policies of Republican presidents reduce abortions and those of Democrats increase them. Okay.
It's not about the policies reduce abortion. We're trying to overturn a major incentive for abortions, which is Roe v. Wade. And so the goal is to try to get this nationwide abortion promotion overturned. And the Republicans actually do chip away at Roe and its implications, while Democrats actually try to remove all barriers to abortion, which is totally the opposite direction.
This is where we need to separate rhetoric from reality. If you look at the two parties' platforms, they couldn't be more different on the issue of abortion. The Republican Party is undeniably pro-life.
Exactly.
And every Republican presidential candidate has advocated pro-life policies for 40 years.
That's right.
The Republican platform calls for overturning Roe, no public funding of abortions, and defunding Planned Parenthood.
The very good, solid.
The Democratic Party platform is the opposite. It calls for supporting Roe, taxpayer funding of abortions, and the expansion of Planned Parenthood.
Everything
if you only
possible.
Look at these platforms, everything seems cut and dry. But the data actually shows something much more complicated. The fact is, abortions have fallen under every president, both Republican and Democrat, for 4 decades. And today, the abortion rate is actually lower than before Roe became law. In other words, electing a Democrat does not increase abortions.
Well, what's happening is that you're taking 2 different types of abortion. You're taking surgical abortions and you're taking chemical abortions. And the chemical abortions are very hard to measure because they're done in the privacy of a woman's home. And so you're counting abortions less accurately now than in the old days when there was only one type of abortion that was a surgical abortion. So statistics could be maintained a little more accurate. But now there are probably just as many abortions taking place or even more abortions taking place now, but they're not being counted because of the different method of abortion, the chemical.
Let's complicate things even more. The abortion rate in America actually fell the most under Barack Obama. On the flip side, in 2019, while Donald Trump was president and the Republicans controlled the Senate, Planned Parenthood, the country's largest abortion provider, broke its record for taxpayer funding. Now, to be clear, I don't think Obama was responsible for reducing abortions during his term, and I don't think Trump was the reason Planned Parenthood broke its public funding record. Like so much about this issue, things are more complicated than that. But this much is clear. The person sitting in the Oval Office is not what matters most when it comes to reducing abortions. Their Supreme Court appointments haven't mattered. Their party platforms haven't mattered. And their rhetoric hasn't mattered. So what has mattered? Why have abortions been declining steadily since the 1980s? Again, it's complicated, but a big factor is that fewer women are facing unplanned pregnancies. Sexual activity among teens is way down compared to 20 years ago, and more women have access to healthcare and long-lasting contraceptives. Some states have also passed laws requiring a waiting period before an abortion. They've limited public funding and restricted late-term abortions. Others have pushed to make adoption more affordable. All of these have contributed to reducing abortions. None of them required Roe to be overturned, and none of them happened because of the president, the Supreme Court, or anyone else in Washington. So what have we learned? We've learned that despite 11 conservative, Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court, for the last 50 years, the court has only upheld rather than reversed abortion rights, and that's unlikely to change. And even if the court did overturn Roe, it would have very little impact because abortion was widely available before Roe, and it would be after. We've also seen that the president and his party have had no impact on abortion as the rate has steadily fallen under both Republican and Democratic administrations due to local and state efforts that have nothing to do with Washington. Finally, we've learned that there are things to be encouraged about too. Abortion rates have fallen dramatically, and they're still going down. And according to a 2020 Notre Dame study, 75% of Americans say abortion should be illegal or only legal under certain circumstances. In other words, there is wide support for common sense limits on abortion. Even more importantly, the Notre Dame study found that most women, including most pro-choice women, do not want an abortion. That may explain why local and state efforts to reduce abortions are so effective. Better adoption laws, waiting periods, crisis pregnancy centers, churches, and support groups who are actually on the ground helping women and walking with them through their pregnancies, that's what's making a difference. Regarding the importance of local...
And we need to continue those, but that doesn't mean we can't continue to seek the illegalization of all abortions.
Local engagement, David French says this: if you're pro-life, the encouraging reality is those things that matter most, your relationships and your local political community, are the things over which you have the most influence. The things that matter the least, the presidency and national politics, are those things most removed from your daily life. But I've been around the pro-life movement enough to know that we often get this exactly backwards. We're most passionate about the president, yet too many of us are less interested in the crisis pregnancy center down the street. And after researching the ineffectiveness of the president and Supreme Court, a professor of Catholic studies at DePaul University said this, quote, "The one strategy for reducing abortions that has been proven to work runs through love, not power. Support for women who may not feel able to carry a pregnancy to term. This requires not blind allegiance to a political party, but the promotion of a culture of life," end quote. There may be good reasons to vote for a Republican candidate for president, but overturning Roe or thinking the president will reduce abortions isn't one of them. Likewise, there are things about the Democratic Party platform I still strongly disagree with, including abortion. But the data clearly shows that voting a Democrat into the White House does not increase abortions.
Okay, so what this actually means is that, and we knew this before because in the pro-life movement, we've been trying to curtail or roll back or end abortion, and we know that even if it's a presidential Republican pick or a Democratic pick, Roe is still with us, abortion is still with us, so on and so forth. But like I said before, when you have a pro-life president, he usually also brings a lot of other pro-family, pro-marriage, a lot of Christian values also with him. And so while we're voting for the end of abortion, we're also voting for a lot of other common sense policy decisions. So we want to look at this and we want to say, hey, this is interesting, but we should not be discouraged from electing pro-life candidates. And we never want to get to the point where we actually vote for a pro-abortion candidate on the basis of this information here. We need to continue to discourage pro-abortion candidates from even running, and we want to encourage pro-life candidates for running. Well, I hope that's been a helpful Christian Answer commentary, and we'll see you back next week. God bless.